He single-handedly defied the harsh Rocky Mountains, living for 64 years in complete isolation amid snow and wild animals. The government tried 3 times to evict him from this federal land, sending armed men and heavy machinery. Each time he flatly refused to leave, defending his tiny plot of land with incredible tenacity. For decades, this hermit remained an unsolvable mystery to the entire local community. But what actually happened to Silas Miller when the authorities came for him one last time? Today's story comes to us from a viewer named John from Durango, Colorado. He writes, "Dear author, my grandfather often told me a legend about an old man who went into the mountains in the 1920s and even frightened the local sheriff." Well, John, thank you so much for this amazing suggestion for our story. I can say with confidence that reality turned out to be far darker and more surprising than any childhood campfire tale. So buckle up, folks. We're heading out on a very long and cold journey. Our story takes place in 1920 in the picturesque but harsh Animas River Valley, Colorado. In those days, this land still retained the spirit of the true wild frontier, despite the arrival of the first automobiles and the telegraph. By all accounts, life here demanded extraordinary willpower and an iron will. Winters in these parts lasted 6 months, bearing the mountain passes under meters of thick snow. It was in these harsh conditions that our main character, the carpenter and blacksmith Silas Miller, lived and worked. Silas was a tall, broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a consistently kind smile on his weather-beaten face. The locals respected him for his honesty, hard work, and willingness to always come to his neighbor's aid. His smithy, located on the outskirts of a small settlement, was never empty and was always filled with the clang of a hammer. He masterfully forged horseshoes, repaired plows, and crafted sturdy tools for farmers. It seems to me that within a 50-mile radius, there wasn't a soul who hadn't heard of his golden hands. But the greatest treasure in Silas's life was his beloved wife Martha and their 2 little boys. Martha was famous throughout the valley for her apple pies and her ability to create comfort from the simplest things. Their small wooden house always smelled of fresh bread, dried herbs, and melted pine resin. In the evenings, the family gathered around the stone hearth, where Silas told the children stories about the first settlers. These quiet hours were a true reward for him after long days of exhausting physical labor. The Millers' property consisted of 40 acres of fertile land, where they grew premium corn. Silas built a spacious barn himself out of thick logs, carefully fitting them together without a single nail. He was constantly making toys for his boys, carving figures of cows, pigs, and horses out of cherry wood. Their farm was always kept in perfect order, reflecting the owner's deep love for this stony soil. It was a world in which a single new calico dress for Martha was considered a real celebration and a huge event. Unfortunately, in 1918, the valley's peaceful life was shattered by the call for men to fight in the Great War in Europe. Silas, a true patriot, went to the front, leaving the farm in the fragile hands of his wife and growing children. He survived gas attacks, artillery fire, and the horrors of trench life, dreaming only of returning to his native Colorado. When he finally stepped onto the threshold of his home in the fall of 1919, his heart was overflowing with boundless happiness. However, along with his old army duffel bag, he brought invisible and merciless death into his home. The Spanish flu, which was raging across the world in those years, did not spare the Miller family's farm, lost in the mountains. The disease progressed rapidly, burning through the lungs faster than the local doctor could reach their remote property. In just one cold November week, Silas lost the most precious thing he had in this life. Martha and both boys slipped away in his arms, leaving behind only a ringing, unbearable emptiness. He built 3 pine coffins with his own hands and buried his family under an old oak tree at the edge of the cornfield. Grief had broken this mighty man, turning him into a pale, silent shadow of the once cheerful blacksmith. While he was fighting and sick, the farm had fallen into disrepair, and his debts to the local bank had reached a critical point. Creditors began knocking on his door, demanding payments and threatening to take the land to settle the loans. Silas made no attempt to argue. He simply sat on the porch, staring for hours at the 3 fresh mounds of earth. The world around him continued to bustle, but for the blacksmith who had lost everything, time had stopped forever. People had little time for long sympathies, for everyone on the frontier was surviving as best they could. Neighbors brought him food and tried to strike up a conversation, but Silas only nodded without uttering a single word. He stopped stoking the forge, allowing rust to cover his beloved tools and anvil. Every object in the empty house, whether a wooden cow or a forgotten apron, caused him unbearable physical pain. Staying in the valley, where everything reminded him of his terrible loss, had become an utterly impossible ordeal for him. One early spring morning in 1920, he began silently gathering his most essential belongings. Silas took an axe, a hunting rifle, several boxes of ammunition, a sturdy rope, and warm woolen blankets. He also carefully wrapped his children's wooden toys in cloth and hid them at the bottom of his backpack. Without saying a word to anyone, without saying goodbye to his neighbors, he simply bolted the door of his house. Leaving all his possessions to the bank, the grief-stricken man set off toward the wildest and most inaccessible peaks. His path led high into the San Juan Mountains, to a place where even the most desperate hunters rarely ventured. In those days, these territories were full of grizzly bears, pumas, and sheer cliffs that forgave not the slightest mistake. Silas was looking for a place where no human could disturb his voluntary and eternal exile. He climbed higher and higher until the Animas Valley became a barely visible green speck far below. It was there, among the eternal snows and silent pines, that his new, incredible life was to begin. On September 23, 1920, Silas reached a hidden high mountain hollow surrounded by impregnable granite walls. This place was at an altitude of over 10,000 feet, where the air was thin and the nights were bitterly cold. A clear spring gushed directly from the rock here, and a dense fir forest grew all around, offering hope for survival. The man dropped his heavy backpack to the ground, and for the first time in many months, took a deep, calm breath. Now this wild, isolated gorge was to become his only home for the rest of his days. There were only a few weeks left before the first heavy snowfalls, and Silas had to work at the limits of human endurance. With nothing but an axe, he felled dozens of ancient trees, stripped them of their branches, and began to hew out a cabin. He lined every corner of his new dwelling with clumps of green moss, carefully sealing all the cracks against the biting wind. He built the roof out of thick bark and sod so it could withstand the multi-ton weight of the coming winter snowfall. Inside, he built a primitive stove out of river stones, binding them with thick clay found by the stream. His first winter alone became the harshest test of his strength and endurance. When the mountain passes were buried under a 20-foot layer of snow, Silas found himself completely cut off from the rest of humanity. He subsisted on the meat of hares and deer he had hunted, saving every scrap of fat to keep his body warm. To keep from going mad from the silence, he spent hours carving new figures out of wood, talking to them. The temperature sometimes dropped so low that water froze right in the bucket next to the hotly stoked stove. He had to fight for his survival every day without hoping for any outside help. Any illness or injury under these conditions would mean an inevitable, agonizing, and very long death. But physical labor healed his wounded soul better than any medicine or comforting conversations with the local pastor. He learned to sew clothes from animal skins, weave snowshoes from willow twigs, and make fire by friction. Years passed, and the blacksmith gradually transformed into a true mountain spirit, blending into the wild nature that surrounded him. A whole decade passed. The harsh 1930s arrived, and America outside the canyon began to change rapidly. The Great Depression ruined thousands of farmers, and the government began actively surveying federal lands and national forests. Colorado state authorities turned their attention to the remote areas of the San Juan Mountains, determined to bring order to their domain. Forest rangers began mapping the territory and, to their great surprise, discovered signs of permanent human habitation high up in the mountains. An official order was issued to find the illegal settler and immediately evict him from state land. In early autumn, the first official delegation arrived at the hermit's cabin, having struggled to climb the steep mountain slope. Two men sat in the wagon left at the foot of the hill. They had to scramble up the rocks on foot. The first was the Honorable August Pick, a highly respected judge and county elder, dressed in a thick woolen suit. Second came the experienced forest ranger Thomas Fitzpatrick, armed with a revolver in case of an unexpected encounter with a wild animal. They had expected to find a deranged vagrant, but instead saw a perfectly maintained log cabin and smoke rising from the chimney. They approached the clearing, treading carefully on the fallen pine needles, and called out loudly to the cabin's owner. The door creaked open, and a man with a thick, gray beard, dressed in homemade leather clothing, stepped onto the threshold. His eyes, accustomed to the boundless expanses, looked at the uninvited guests with a cold, bone-chilling calm. In his hands, he held a rifle polished to a shine, the hammer cocked with a casual yet firm grip. The forest around them seemed utterly silent, as if nature itself had held its breath in anticipation of the outcome of this tense encounter. Judge Peak cleared his throat, adjusted his hat, and tried to lend his voice as much official sternness as possible. "Buddy, you're trespassing on federal land, and I suppose you'll have to pack up right now," said August. Silas slowly spat on the ground, glanced at the heavily breathing officials, and smiled slightly under his mustache. "It seems to me that this land belongs only to the Lord and the bears, not to your office paperwork," the hermit replied hoarsely. It was the first time in 10 long years that he had used his voice to speak to living people.
We need shelter.
Thomas Fitzpatrick placed his hand on his holster and reminded the old man that the law applies to all citizens. However, Silas only gripped his rifle tighter and declared that he would rather lie in this land than leave it. He explained that down there was nothing left for him but pain, debts, and old graves. The old man warned that anyone who tried to drag him out of here by force would get a bullet between the eyes without further warning. His tone was so convincing and steady that not a single official doubted the reality of this threat. Realizing they were facing a man who had absolutely nothing to lose, the officials decided to retreat. The judge silently nodded to the ranger, and they began to slowly back away toward the trail, trying not to make any sudden movements. And while August Peak watched this, the old hermit turned smoothly and quietly disappeared into the dark forest. The cabin door slammed shut, and the ravine once again sank into its familiar, age-old primeval silence. Thus ended the government's first attempt to regain control over the tiny patch of mountains that Silas considered his own. Upon returning to town, the shaken August and Thomas immediately drafted a detailed report on their encounter with the armed madman. They described his strange clothing made of animal skins, the impeccable condition of his weapons, and his blood-chilling determination to defend his territory. The county sheriff listened carefully to their account, but decided that sending a squad into the mountains after a single old man was too dangerous. In those days, law enforcement had enough problems with bootleggers and bandits to risk lives for the sake of a stubborn hermit. Therefore, the Silas case was temporarily shelved, gathering dust in the police archives. However, keeping such a story under wraps in a small town was practically impossible, no matter how hard the authorities tried. Rumors spread faster than the creaking of wagon wheels on Colorado's rocky roads on market day. Local hunters and farmers whispered in taverns about the mountain spirit that had forced even Judge Pike to retreat. Some called him a dangerous maniac. Others secretly admired his courage and ability to stand up to the government. The name Silas Miller began to turn into a true local legend, one that frightened children and intrigued adults. The reaction of the community in Durango was mixed. Many old-timers still remembered the kind blacksmith and his tragic fate. They sympathized with his loss and believed that the authorities should leave the old man alone to live out his days. The younger generation, however, saw him as a relic of a savage past, a barbarian who refused to obey the common rules. Arguments in local shops sometimes grew so heated they left people hoarse, dividing the townspeople into two irreconcilable camps. But none of them dared to climb the mountains to verify the truth of these incredible rumors for themselves. Meanwhile, decades passed inexorably, bringing incredible technological and social changes to the world. America went through World War II. People bought televisions, began listening to rock and roll on the radio, and driving fast cars. Cities sprawled, covered in asphalt and concrete, and passenger planes buzzed through the sky with increasing frequency. But high in the San Juan Mountains, time stood still in the 19th century, untouched by civilization. Silas continued to chop wood with an axe, light his cabin with animal fat, and live by the ancient laws of survival. In the early 1950s, the government made a second, more determined attempt to evict the stubborn mountaineer. The authorities sent a whole group of armed marshals with clear orders to arrest the squatter and burn down his illegal structure. But when the squad reached the right ravine, they found the cabin completely empty, though the stove still held warmth. Silas, who knew every rock in the area like the back of his hand, had simply vanished into the rocks, watching them from a safe distance. The marshals were afraid to set up an ambush in the unfamiliar forest and returned empty-handed, cursing the cunning old man. In the years that followed, only a few brave souls managed to catch a glimpse of the legendary hermit from afar. The local priest, Reverend Josiah Smith, once stumbled upon him during a solitary walk in the foothills. He described Silas as a tall, gaunt old man with long gray hair, moving silently like a mountain lion. The old man showed no aggression. He simply gazed at the pastor for a long time with his deep, sorrowful eyes. Then he turned and soon disappeared into the thick undergrowth, leaving the priest in a state of reverent awe. The official response to these rare encounters was always accompanied by sensational headlines in the local newspapers. Reporters concocted the most absurd stories, calling Silas a snowman or a fugitive Nazi criminal. Scientists from the state university even proposed organizing an expedition to study the psyche of a man who had lived in isolation for so many years. The authorities regularly issued stern decrees, promising to clear the national park of its illegal occupant. But all these documents remained mere words while the old man continued to rule his little forest empire. The third and final attempt by the authorities to expel him took place during the turbulent 1970s using modern technology. Police helicopters circled the gorge several times, trying to track down the hermit from the air with binoculars. Loudspeakers broadcast demands for him to surrender, promising him comfortable housing in a nursing home and a full pardon. However, the dense canopies of the ancient trees reliably concealed the hut, and Silas himself was a master at blending into the landscape. In the end, the officials simply gave up on him, deciding to wait for this absurd situation to resolve itself naturally. Strange additional events began to occur around him, only adding to the overall mystery. Local residents, who had come to respect the old man, began secretly leaving sacks of salt and ammunition at the foot of the mountain. Sometimes these gifts would disappear, and in their place would appear intricately carved wooden animal figurines. Hunters spoke of complex, primitive traps on the trails that were clearly man-made. The tension surrounding this mystery grew steadily, turning the story of Silas into a true myth of the American West. This continued until the harsh winter of 1984, when the mountains were once again blanketed by record snowfalls and bitter cold. Hunters watching the gorge through binoculars from the neighboring valley noticed something alarming. The smoke that had risen faithfully above the treetops every morning for decades suddenly ceased to appear. The silence hanging over the mountain seemed heavier and gloomier than ever before. It became clear that the 64-year saga of the Great Mountain Hermit had reached its inevitable conclusion. Before we find out exactly what the rescuers discovered in that icy hut, let me give you a little advice. Give the one you love peace of mind and safety with a professional survival kit from our partners at Frontier Gear. This compact backpack contains everything you need for emergencies, from a reliable fire starter to a warm blanket that can save you in the harshest blizzard. Click the link in the description below to get a special discount for our loyal viewers. Now let's return to our gripping story and uncover the final secret of old Silas. In the spring of 1984, when the snow on the mountain passes had melted a little, the authorities organized a large-scale search expedition. The group consisted of experienced mountaineers, rescuers, and several police officers, ready to face any unexpected challenges. They followed old maps, struggling to cut a path through thick underbrush and trees toppled by winter storms. The ascent took 2 grueling days, during which every member of the team wondered what exactly awaited them at the top. The air was thick with tension when they finally emerged onto the familiar clearing in front of the log cabin, blackened by time. An absolute deathly silence reigned around the hut, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind in the fir branches. The door was locked from the inside with a heavy wooden bolt, and the windows were tightly shut with massive shutters. The police had to use crowbars to break down the entrance and enter the dark, bone-chillingly cold room. The smell of old smoke, dried herbs, and something elusively sad, something that had long since left this world, hit their noses. The rescuers turned on powerful flashlights, and the beams of light began to reveal, from the darkness, the surprising details of the hermit's life. And so, debates about this moment continued for several decades in the bars and on the farms of Durango. People put forward all sorts of theories, some of them utterly fantastical, about who Silas Miller had actually become. Some claimed he had completely turned into a wild beast and would attack anyone who entered his lair. Others whispered that he had found Indian gold in the mountains and was sitting on sacks of treasure. Still others believed that he had long since left this place and gone even further north into the endless Canadian forests. The first theory about hidden gold always drew the most greedy and desperate adventurers to the mountains. People sincerely believed that the old man refused to leave the land precisely because he was guarding a rich vein. They thought that chests filled to the brim with glittering nuggets from the Animas River were buried under the floor of his cabin. This version was fueled by old legends about the lost mines of the Spanish conquistadors in the San Juan Mountains. However, the rescuers found not a single shiny pebble in the cabin, only neatly stacked firewood and tools. The second theory was that solitude had completely robbed him of his human reason and sanity. Locals believed that a person could not live 64 years without human contact and not go mad. They expected the walls of the hut to be smeared with blood and to find terrifying totems made of animal bones inside. Many feared that the old man had turned into a bloodthirsty Wendigo from the terrifying Native American tales. But the order inside the house struck the rescuers with its perfect cleanliness and meticulous mathematical precision. The third, most romantic version claimed that Silas had escaped old age by crossing the Northern Pass. Romantics believed that this mighty man had outwitted death itself and found a secret valley of eternal youth. They told stories of how they had seen his silhouette against the moon, fading into the distance toward Alaska. People wanted to believe that the spirit of the frontier could not be broken or confined within the four walls of a log cabin. But reality, as is often the case, turned out to be more down-to-earth, more prosaic, and far more touching than any speculation. But if you really want to know the truth, here is what the search party found inside the cabin. On a bed neatly covered with reindeer skins lay Silas Miller himself, peacefully asleep forever at the age of over 90. He was dressed in a clean, hand-sewn shirt, and his hands were folded calmly across his chest. No signs of struggle, illness, or madness, only a quiet acceptance of his inevitable end. And on a rough wooden table, illuminated by the beam of a police flashlight, lay a stack of thick diaries filled with fine handwriting. These entries were a true revelation to those who had spent their whole lives regarding him as a savage and a madman. But this was not because he hated the world or the people beyond the walls of his ravine. It was because he loved his lost family too much to let time erase their images. In his diaries, he kept a calendar with striking precision, describing changes in nature, the weather, and animal behavior. He even knew about the moon landing from a scrap of newspaper dropped by tourists, but it didn't bother him in the least. Did he ever regret his radical choice in his rejection of the comforts of modern civilization? Judging by the last pages of the diary, he never once doubted the rightness of his incredibly difficult path. Instead of returning to the city, he created his own ideal world inside that little cabin. Rescuers found thousands of masterfully carved wooden figures, houses, people, horses, and smiling children. Over 64 years, Silas literally carved his new valley out of wood, a place where no one ever died. The story of this unyielding man makes us reflect on the limits of human endurance and strength of spirit. Are modern people, accustomed to comfort and constant communication, capable of enduring even a week of such isolation? What drives us when we face unbearable pain? The desire to flee or the attempt to rebuild our world? This riddle of the old blacksmith will forever hang in the frosty air above the peaks of the San Juan Mountains. Is it possible that someone watching this right now knows the answer and could follow in his footsteps? That's the story, my friends. Now you know the rest of the story of Silas Miller and his self-imposed exile. I want to express my immense gratitude to John from Durango for sending us this amazing local legend. Be sure to send your own historical discoveries and stories to my email. I love reading them. Thank you so much for watching, and please take care of yourselves and your loved ones. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to hear more true stories about the settlement of the American frontier.